very much. I must thank all of you for coming. What I propose to talk about today are two diaries. One that one of the Rheinburger migrants wrote. His name's called Muller, but I'll call him Rheinburger for the purposes of the exercise and explain to you why. And the other one is a Schneider diary from the early 1800s, from the town that the group came from. I won't go into the context in great detail today because I have an hour tomorrow morning in which at that time I'll certainly go into the German migration in great detail then. What I wanted to do this afternoon was to talk about the importance, in my opinion, of the work that we all do. And I use the we because many of you will do quite a lot of research and say, oh, it's just for me. You won't put it into context, and I'll explain in a minute why that context is so extremely important, nor will you think of publishing it. And publishing it is imperative. We at the RAHS administer grants that the government and various bodies give us, and we farm those out, 200, 5,000, some of them are just a couple of $100, but they enable organisations such as your own to actually publish the work you do. And you think, why is that important? Well, the most important reason, I'll refer today, and I'm indebted to the Mudgee Historical Society, because in 1970, we're now talking, what are we talking? My maths is reasonable. 45 years ago. Yeah, 45 years ago, two women from Mudgee, and I'll give you their names, Rosemary Janssen and Elvira Lusty, actually translated the diary of John Muller, whose parents were Rheinburger. These two women translated these diaries, and I'm sure they're probably in your Historical Society library as well as here in the library. They're certainly in the RAHS library, but I'm also indebted to the Rheinburger families, who collectively now become Hughes, Brill, Muller. These people, all through my research, have made their work or their records available to me, and it's because these works have been translated and are held in repositories that I had the access to them. And one of the books that I've published, and I've now given a copy of this plus another work to your librarian here, and this work will sit here in your library if you choose to look at further information. But the original of that Muller diary has gone missing. And some of the family actually said to me, yes, it went into the Mitchell Library, and for whatever reason, it was taken back by one of the family and burnt. Oh. Now, the great safety in all of you doing work and publishing it is that if one of your family decides to burn something, the rest of us still have copies and we have access. So that's part of the reason I think it's important. We administer to a number of affiliated societies. We know there are about 44,000 members across the state. So if you think you can't do it, there'll be somebody in your society that will help you, as they've helped me over the years. And I think that's why I'm so passionate in saying, join your local society, they'll help you, you'll help them. But to come to the Rheinburger work, and as I said, I want to deal with two aspects today. One is John Muller's diary. I've called him a Rheinburger. This is the map of Germany, and in fact, the area I'm going to talk about, what used to be coming up to the Rhine River, there's the Rhine River. This area here is Wiesbaden, and here's the Rhine River coming along here and up there. And it keeps going up to almost opposite Cologne. And I mention this because the work I've done detailed in this book is about the Duchy of Nassau. Just a tiny bit of context before I get on to John Muller's diary. The German situation, as other people have said to you today, there were 35 different states in 1850, and I'm going to look at two, John Muller and the 1850s migration. But there were a huge number of states. Some of these people spoke a variant of German, but Germany didn't exist until 1871. Italy, 1861. So when these people came here, as the Muller-Rheinburger clan did to Mudgee, Germany didn't exist. They left the Duchy of Nassau. And so they were technically speaking Nassauans. And of course that disappeared under Bismarck in 1871. It had gone by 1866. But to come to John Muller, because I'll do the history of it in greater detail tomorrow, what happened in this part of the world, if we take it straight in history, we go convicts, we then have a need for labour, it's no different to today, and we ended up with mountains of free settlers. 1.5 million came in that 19th century. And amongst those there was a need for pastoralists or shepherds and vine dressers. So the Germans living along that Rhine area that you can see had experience for at least 1,000 years in growing vines and producing wine. The town of Frauenstein, which is this, it's a glorious little town, I love it to death. They grow only cherries, certainly wine, and if any of you are descendants of the group and choose to go to any of those little villages on the Rhine, they're beautiful, absolutely beautiful. But to come back to the story, we needed vine dressers. We paid for these people to come. Migration from Frauenstein, which I've spent a lot of time on, was predominantly 1852 to 54. At that stage, to Australia came the Rheinburgers, and there were two Rheinburgers, one called John, who settled in Bega with his family, the other was Valentine of Valentin, who came here. They married two sisters. And these were Schneider women. Kathrine Schneider came here, Elizabeth Schneider died on the boat on the way out. I've read some of the information published about the Mullers from this area, and I can tell you that I don't consider it to be all correct. This is the reason we publish, because others come along and say, well, the information I've got, I think that's not quite right. When Elizabeth Schneider died, her daughter and youngest son also died with her. Now, the reason I would suggest is that there was cholera on the boat, and 40 people died. And they died from cholera. They didn't die from lack of food, which is the reason given. It was cholera. But the other family of Rheinberg survived and came here. And again, why am I so passionate? John Muller was 15. His father had died, so his mother married Valentine Rheinberger. And they came with 6 children. They arrived in Sydney, April of 1855 from the Caesar. And how did they get to Mudgee? They walked. You know, Kathrine Reinberger with her 6 children. John was the only one who was over 12, so she had 5 children under 12, and with her husband they walked. And Christine mentioned James Walker. He was the person that they were indentured to. They arrived here after a month of walking, and of course, what does James Walker speak? He speaks English. They speak German. And in John Muller's diary, and Christine made the point that history is also not just events, but it's the lives of the local people. And through John Muller's diary, we get this fabulous picture of this young 15-year-old boy, his 5 half-brothers and sisters, his mother, Kathrine Rheinberger, nee Schneider, and the father, and they walk from Sydney, meet up with James Walker, and he says, a bit further down the road. Well, it's another month down the road. So they actually walk for 8 weeks. And Kathrine Rheinberger cried. I probably would have cried too. It started to rain, so they had to hide under the wagon that they were travelling with, and they dug a little gully around it so they didn't get wet. And you think, all right, she's got these 5 children under 12 and John, but at least he writes a diary. This is all in his diary, and this is all here. I believe it's here in the library, but it's certainly freely available. They eventually got to Yarra Grin, where John, as I said, is 15 years of age. His stepfather, who was like a father to him, and many of you may know John Muller and the Rheinberger family, I hold them in great regard. The more I read of their stories, they've documented their history very well, but what a family. John Muller has walked for 2 months, and the boss says, can you ride a horse? And he says, well, I can learn. And so they give him 200 head of cattle. Well, you know, I've worked cattle in my younger days and sheep. 200 head of cattle if you've never ridden a horse is jolly difficult. But as his diary goes on, he's actually moving 6,000 head of sheep. He's drafting significant numbers of sheep and he's managing. And I think that the stories that come through in this diary, they're very, very sad. He has a 4-year-old sister. His mother, she's making straw hats. She's off working. They all contribute to the family livelihood. But the 4-year-old is showing the little ones how the Aborigines would rub sticks together to make a fire. And of course what happens? Her dress catches fire. No, she dies. The family come home to find their 4-year-old sister dead. You know, it's the way it was. When they arrive here, they've got 1 hut. There are 6 children, a husband and wife. They work very hard. They're given rations. They're indentured for 2 years. And in John's diary, you trace the amount of money that they make from this hard work. They're making cheese and selling it. She's making straw hats. John Muller, of course, is employed immediately. He talks about trying to learn English. And in time, he of course writes his diary up until his death. He marries Louisa Huff, and I think they have 7 children. He donates vast sums of money to the local Catholic Church, because many of them were Catholics. He was a Catholic. But they are pillars of their community and society, contributing in ways that, if we don't publish the stories, we will never know. Again, you know, the cheese making, they made £40 a year, whereas when the father was indentured, he's been paid £20 a year. You know, and I think the mother made £35 a year from her work. Some of the things that amused me in the diary, and their nearest church was 92 miles away because they moved further out and bought their own property. And of course, John Muller says it took him 4.5 days to ride to Mudgee. And they would come in here for whatever reason to go to church. They'd go to confession and they'd go to church. In the very early days, he says, the mother was of course upset because there were no priests. But an Irish priest turned up and they had a quasi-mass, and he said, oh, mother wanted to confess, but she only spoke German, so she confessed in German and he listened in Irish. And you think, these are the stories. These are our history. And if we don't write our history and record it, somebody else will, and it won't necessarily be our story. And I'll come now on to Anton Schneider's diary. Anton Schneider stayed in Frauenstein, and he was the brother of Kathrine and Elizabeth Schneider. And by sheer fluke, someone put it on the website, and it was a person, his name's Norbert Mickel, and he has the Rheingau website. It's in German, but Norbert Mickel very kindly made this diary available to me. It's almost a day-by-day description of life in Frauenstein from 1828 through to 1888 when he died. And of course, one of the things he says that resonated with me was we lit a candle when his sisters left Frauenstein, which they did I think in November, December, took the train to Hamburg, and from Hamburg they took the Caesar to Australia. Not all German migrants came from Hamburg, some came from Bremerhaven and also Le Hague and from Antwerp, but many came from Hamburg. And he talks of his sisters being on the boat now and how wonderful they have arrived in the new country. And of course, when the candle went out, it was a long time, and it took 3 months for the candle to go out, and he records all of this in his diary. And it's, in many cases, a year before information comes back saying, look, I'm terribly sorry, your sister and 2 of your children, your nephews and your niece have died. The turnaround time for these letters, and many of these are in this book, from people from Frauenstein to Australia and from people who've migrated here back. But that tyranny of distance, it can be 2 years in the turnaround time. They write a letter, it gets here, there's harvest and hard work, and it can be 2 years before they actually receive letters back saying what their relatives are doing. In this, I'm aware that John Muller has said, oh, we've sent money back. And he talks about the Bega connection and the Rheinburgers in Bega, because they're family. We're 3 dead. John Rheinburger in Bega had a lot of male children, and I was surprised that the marriage rates were not that high. And I suspect, given that the mother died and they lost the brother and sister, that they were probably quite traumatised in coming to Australia. Schneider's diary also has stories in it about certainly the effect of war, and I'll go into much greater detail. Much of the story on the German migration I believe not to be correct, but one of the nice little stories that occurs in his diary is it actually relates to the Rheinburger boys, and who are cousins, and he says that there was this huge flood in Frauenstein, and Frauenstein is only about a mile from the Rhine, and it's built on both sides of the hill. So it's very hard for me to imagine how on earth it could have flooded, except that I'm guessing the water came down the hills and it whooshed through, and he says that the Rheinburger boys helped lead the animals out of the flood. So we get further clues because he'd written a diary for 60 years about life in Frauenstein. He details catching rabbits, that there was black ice, and the rabbits couldn't get down their little holes, and so people could run out, and many families got 4 to 6 rabbits each. So Anton Schneider, a brother of the 2 women who married Rheinburger boys, writes a very detailed diary about life in Frauenstein. He also says migration fever had struck, because 150 people, including the 2 Rheinburger men, left that village and came to Australia. I believe because we paid their fares. It was really that simple. And in doing the work that I've done here, one of the things that's happened, this book is in English and German, and I'm very proud to say that a German university is now using some of the theories from this textbook. Now it says that was very worthwhile for me, that the ideas I put forward, I think they're right, others may not, but people will argue about them. And when I come back to these diaries, all I can say is that your stories, our stories, are extremely important. We do the best we can, but we have to record them. We as an institution of the RAHS will certainly help. Your local societies will help. This is the village of Frauenstein. It still has 40% of the old people living there. Old people meaning they lost 150 out of 800 people. So they lost about 15% of their population. And I've given lectures in Germany, particularly in this area, and they're so excited to have some idea of what has happened. When I talk about John Muller's diary, they can't possibly envisage walking for 8 weeks to get to somewhere. And here's it's called the Berg, but it's like a fort. The main part of the town, here's the church. If you see that tree, it's believed to be 300 years old. And look at the size of the trunk. And that church was the church they all went to. The church records for the Duchy of Nassau are all up in the archive at Limburg. It's the church archive in Limburg. It's a 1 hour, 40 minutes ride by train from Wiesbaden. But they're all there. And you can actually trace relatives if you choose. That was Anton Schneider's house. So the red roof, it's the house directly in front of it. That's now being knocked down. This is the way of all flesh. But that house in front was Anton Schneider's house. And so his sisters, you can see those 2 streets. The street on the left leads up to the church. There's the Berg, the little tower that in the 11th century when this town was built, people would have stood up there to see if the enemy was coming. And the enemy could have been the people from the next town if that was the Protestant town. This was a Catholic town, 96% Catholic. But it is a beautiful little town. This is 1900. The houses weren't in such good condition as they are now. The times changed, but nevertheless, those people who left sold land to leave this town and come to Mudgee, where Rheinburgers had a wood hut, husband, wife, 6 children. Here they've got stone houses, and there are still houses built in the 1500s in this town. They had a church, they had a village school from 1680, they had a community, they learnt music. This is a Muller house, but it's another John Muller from Bury. If you look at the house, this is a very good house in the 1870s, 1880s in Australia. But compare it to what you saw in Frauenstein and stone houses, it's significantly different coming to the Australian colony. I love this one. This is the Armada Hof. It's in Frauenstein. This was, and there were 4 hunting lodges that the Duke of Nassau, Duke of Nassau inhabited. This was occupied by Napoleon's troops. And the letters detail other wars, not Napoleon, when they marched into Frauenstein. And what the locals say is, our wine was fabulous, the soldiers loved it, there were 900 soldiers billeted here, we all drank too much, and they had a wonderful time. These are just some pictures I took in Mudgee about 10 years ago, but this is not unlike what the Rhineland villages look like. The cherry blossoms and the vines. And I love this. Rolf was one of the people who came from Frauenstein. Because when I took this photo, I went in and I bought bottles of wine, I took them back to Frauenstein, and the people there were delighted, absolutely delighted. Love this. If you're trying to chase German history, what a little nightmare. Gunkel came from this town, married, he's just married, I think he was 20, wife, Anna Elizabeth, I forget her surname. What I love, look at the names, 2, 4, 6. Come down and look at the children. Martin is registered as Gongel. Come down to Christian, born in 55, Gonkler. We then get another Sperry from Melling, that's Melling from Mary, Colin, and then Gunklel. And of course they moved from down, I think he started in Shoalhaven too, but they ended up in the Richmond River area. But what amuses me about this is what makes work in this area so difficult, that the names keep changing. Now, on that note, there's 4 minutes. If you'd like to ask questions, it would be my great pleasure. Come. Pardon? Do I keep a diary? No. I'm so busy. I'm so busy snooping on everybody else's diaries and their letters. Carol was referring to our work on convicts. We found, and we are using convict letters. What great excitement. Why is it exciting? Because they're telling the story of their time in their words.
Have you come across John Muller from Urungi?
Yes, that is John Muller. It's his diary.
It's his diary?
Yes.
My age.
No. Sorry.
There's a John Muller who's my age, was in my class, and he now lives at a little village out of Corrinabray. He was a big family of boys, 5 boys.
Was he a magistrate?
No.
Okay.
they all grew fruit there. So John and Peter and Paul all left when they left school and went up to Corinabri wheat farming for an elderly gentleman who owned a huge property, and he died and left the property to them. My husband and I visited John out there 10 or 15 years ago, and he lives in a little village whose name I can't remember. Pocketaroo. We got to the signpost of Pocketaroo and looked along a road that was like a gun barrel, and we didn't know where his house was. We didn't have GPS. So Mike phoned him, and he said, "Mike, if you look straight ahead, you'll see 3 houses. Ours is the middle one." When we got there, and he's the best joke teller you'd ever come across.
Look, they're storytellers, the Germans. They all play music and
jokes too.
tell stories.
Anyway, he was missing his right arm because it had got caught in a wheat auger. He said, "It doesn't matter, I've got another one."
That's right.
And when we visited him, he was delivering the mail from Corinabri in his ute. So he wedged us into his ute to show us around the district as he was delivering the mail. And it was a manual ute that had a
Gear change.
steering wheel gear change. And with one arm he was doing this and changing this, everything.
There are many of them I've met. I've come up and
completely
given,
undaunted by all these hardships.
I've come up and given talks to the various families that are connected with the Rheinburger group at Urundari, and I continue to be grateful to Henry Rheinburger and the John Rheinburger that I knew. I think John Rheinburger has retired up to Coffs Harbour area. He was a magistrate in Western Sydney. But they're very, very large families, as you would all know far better than I.
I had one in my family who married a Rainer.
Oh, really? Thank you very much.